Take off your goggles up there and you've got about 10 minutes before you permanently lose your vision. Let that sink in for a moment. The human body simply was not built for the conditions that exist at the altitudes we're talking about today. At those heights, your organism doesn't just struggle, it starts to fall apart, piece by piece. And some of the ways it does that will genuinely surprise you. Take something that sounds almost trivial, a cough. At extreme altitude, what we call high-altitude cough is anything but trivial. The air up there is so cold and so dry that every breath you take is like inhaling tiny shards of ice. That air tears through your lungs, drying out and shredding the delicate tissue lining your airways. And then the coughing starts. Not a gentle, polite little cough. We're talking violent, relentless, convulsive spasms. So violent, in fact, that people have literally broken their own ribs. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. Climbers have cracked their own ribs simply from coughing too hard. Think about that the next time someone tells you high altitude is just about being a little short of breath. And then there's the cold, obviously. The bone-deep, savage cold that every mountaineer prepares for. Frostbite is a constant companion up there. Fingers, toes, hands, feet, even noses can be lost. But here's something that catches even experienced climbers off guard. The heat. Yes, you heard that right. On Everest, the snow and ice act like enormous mirrors, reflecting sunlight back at you from every direction. In a place called the Western Cwm, a sheltered glacial valley on the mountain, daytime temperatures can actually climb to plus 32 degrees Celsius. That's nearly 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Sunburn. In the death zone, surrounded by glaciers. The mountain will bake you and freeze you, sometimes almost simultaneously, and it doesn't care which one gets you first. But of all the dangers that lurk on the world's highest peaks, two conditions stand above the rest in terms of sheer lethality: pulmonary edema and cerebral edema, fluid buildup in the lungs and brain. When your body is starved of oxygen at extreme altitude, it starts doing desperate things internally. It generates abnormal pressure gradients, and fluid begins to seep into places it absolutely should not be. First come the warning signs: crushing fatigue, shallow breathing, dizziness. Then a cough that produces blood. And finally, when the brain itself is suffocating from oxygen deprivation, something deeply frightening happens. Rational thought disappears. Judgment collapses. Climbers in the grip of cerebral edema make decisions that, from the outside, look completely insane, but to them, in that moment, feel perfectly logical. They lose their sense of direction. They lose themselves. And that is how many of the great mountains have claimed their victims, not through a single dramatic catastrophe, but through this slow, quiet unraveling of the mind. The cure, medically speaking, is simple. Descend. Get lower. Get thicker air into your lungs. But here's the brutal irony. By the time these symptoms become obvious, the climber is often no longer physically capable of descending on their own. They need help. They need to be carried. And at those altitudes, in those conditions, rescue is often simply not possible. By the time help could arrive, it's already too late. So why? Why does Everest pull people in like this? Why do human beings, rational, intelligent people who understand every single one of these risks, keep going back? The cost of an Everest expedition runs into the tens of thousands of dollars. You might lose your fingers, you might lose your nose, you might not come back at all. And yet the queues on that mountain keep getting longer every decade. Let's put the scale of this place into perspective for a moment. Everest is roughly 10 times taller than the tallest skyscraper on Earth. Try to picture stacking 5,000 people on top of each other. That's the kind of altitude we're talking about. A place so high above sea level that commercial aircraft fly at roughly similar heights. A place where human beings have no business being and yet keep going anyway. Let's try a thought experiment. Imagine you're heading up with a group of 4, Maybe your brother, your sister, your best friend, a parent, people you love, people you do anything for. Now the statistics step in and tell you coldly that on average, 1 in every 4 people who attempt this mountain doesn't come home. 1 in 4. So right now, standing there with your group, you'd have to silently look around and wonder, which one of us isn't coming back? No rational person can make that calculation. No one is psychologically ready to point at someone they love and say, it's probably going to be you. And yet the moment you decide to go, you have accepted exactly that reality. You have agreed to those odds on behalf of everyone in your party. And still, decade after decade, people go. There's a famous answer to the question of why. 3 words spoken by a celebrated mountaineer when asked why he wanted to climb Everest. His answer? Because it's there. 3 words that became legendary, the most quoted phrase in the entire history of alpinism. And the man who said them? He later died attempting to reach that very summit, which somehow makes those 3 words even more powerful and even more haunting. But the full answer to why Everest does this to us is far richer and more complicated than 3 words can capture. In this episode, we're going to trace how this mountain didn't just challenge human bodies, it reshaped human ambition. It became the measuring stick against which we tested what we were capable of. A symbol, a mirror, a place where civilization looked at itself and asked, how far can we actually go? Before we get into all of that, though, you're going to want to gear up properly. Extra gloves, crampons, oxygen tank, and keep in mind, statistically speaking, 1 in 4 of us might not make it back. Now, to understand how Everest came to occupy the place it holds in the human story, we need to go back to a time when no one in the Western world even knew the mountain existed. And to understand that, we need to talk about maps, and about an empire that was desperately trying to understand what it had conquered. If you've been following this channel for a while, you'll know that we've returned more than once to the story of India and British dominance in the region. That's not an accident. The British Empire's grip on the Indian subcontinent shaped history in ways that are still rippling outward today. But there's one chapter of that story that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it begins not with soldiers or merchants, but with surveyors. The British wanted to know exactly what they had taken. This was the era before satellites, before aerial photography, before any of the tools we now take for granted when it comes to understanding the shape of the world. If we'd had photographs from space, a great deal would have been obvious much earlier, including the existence of a mountain that the local people considered sacred, a peak they called Chomolungma, rising to an elevation of 8,848 meters above sea level. But in those days, none of that was known with any precision. Maps were incomplete, unreliable, full of gaps. From the founding of the British Trading Organization in India at the very beginning of the 17th century, through to the point in the 19th century when Britain had consolidated control over a vast portion of the subcontinent, they employed cartographers and surveyors to document their new territories. It was one of these cartographers, working in Bengal, who noticed that there were no reliable measurements for large sections of the newly acquired lands. That observation set something extraordinary in motion. In 1800, the British launched one of the most ambitious surveying projects in human history, the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. The goal was to systematically determine the precise location, elevation, and names of every significant geographical feature across the entire subcontinent, including the mountain ranges that were beginning to come into view as survey teams pushed northward. The work began in the south and slowly, painstakingly, moved north over the course of decades. The instruments they used were called theodolites, precision optical devices for measuring angles, distances, and elevations. In those days, a single theodolite weighed in at around 500 kilograms, Moving one required a team of a dozen men just to carry it. This was not fast work, and it was not comfortable work, but it was extraordinarily accurate work, and the theodolite, in much lighter and more sophisticated form, is still used in surveying to this day. By the early 1830s, the survey teams had finally reached the foothills of the Himalayas, and that's where they hit a wall, not a physical one, but a political one. The government of Nepal flatly refused to allow the British surveyors to cross into Nepali territory, and honestly, the suspicion was completely justified. The British had a habit of showing up with supposedly scientific objectives and leaving with someone else's country. Applications to enter Nepal were submitted repeatedly, framed as purely academic exercises, and rejected almost as often. This meant the British surveyors were forced to work from observation posts located well to the south of the Himalayan range, peering north across enormous distances, trying to measure peaks they couldn't even get close to. The conditions in those southern lowland stations were brutal in their own right. Monsoon seasons brought torrential rains that made work nearly impossible for months at a time, and the region was rife with malaria, a disease that, over the course of the survey, killed a staggering proportion of the men involved. Of every 3 survey workers stationed in those lowland positions along the Himalayan foothills, now let's put this into perspective. Several of the officers working on this survey died from malaria. 2 more were forced into early retirement because their health had simply collapsed beyond repair. And yet, despite all of that, the survey work pressed on through 1847, with measurements being taken from stations nearly 250 kilometers away from the peaks themselves. On top of that, the weather only allowed useful observation windows of about 3 months per year. Just 3 months. Try to wrap your head around what that actually means in practice. Most of us would find it a challenge to measure a table from across the room. These British surveyors were attempting to calculate the height of nearly 9-kilometer-tall mountains from 250 kilometers away, often in rain, often with poor visibility. And yet what they recorded with their own eyes and later confirmed through mathematics still inspires awe today. The man overseeing all of this was Britain's Surveyor General of India, the official responsible for mapping the entire subcontinent. He managed the whole network of observation stations and coordinated the measurement campaign in the middle of the 19th century. At the time, the reigning assumption was that Kangchenjunga was the tallest peak in the world. But systematic observation started revealing something unexpected, another mountain, located roughly 230 kilometers away, that appeared to be even taller. One of the assistants also spotted it from a station positioned even further to the west. They gave it a working name, Peak B or Peak 15. Early readings were already hinting that it might surpass Kangchenjunga, but that 250-kilometer gap between the observation posts and the mountain made any immediate definitive confirmation impossible. You can't just announce you found the world's tallest mountain based on a glimpse from 250 kilometers out. They had to get closer. They had to repeat the measurements. And so they did. Over the following years, observations were conducted from progressively nearer positions. A year later, readings from roughly 190 kilometers away confirmed that Peak 15 did appear to be taller than Kangchenjunga. Then came a whole series of measurements from the east, taken dozens of times from 5 different locations, with the nearest station sitting approximately 170 kilometers from the mountain. By now, there was enough data to actually sit down and do the math. And when they did, the numbers were unambiguous. This newly identified summit was genuinely higher than Kangchenjunga, which itself reaches nearly 8,600 meters. Initial calculations placed the new peak somewhere between 9,200 and 10,200 meters. That, as you might guess, was a significant overestimate. Part of the problem was that nobody had fully accounted for atmospheric refraction, the way the atmosphere bends light, distorting observed angles and distances. When you're working from stations hundreds of kilometers away, those distortions add up fast. Still, every single data point pointed in the same direction. Peak 15 towers over Kangchenjunga. The working name stuck. The question now was how to nail down its actual height with precision. And here's the thing, you can't just measure a mountain with a ruler. In the second half of the 19th century, there were no satellites, no global positioning system. Practically speaking, there were two options. 1. Climb to the top and measure directly. In the 1850s, that was completely out of the question. 2. Use complex trigonometric calculations built from multiple observations across varied positions. That second option demanded painstaking arithmetic and a very high degree of accuracy. In the mid-1850s, a brilliant Indian mathematician took on that challenge. Through meticulous analysis and the application of trigonometric methods, he became the first person to demonstrate mathematically that Peak 15 was, in fact, the highest mountain on Earth. After his calculations were reviewed and confirmed multiple times, the official announcement came in March of 1856. Those calculations were accepted as the definitive basis, and the world's tallest mountain was assigned an official height of 8,840 meters. Now, it's worth noting that this was a calculated value, and it was later reviewed and slightly revised. Modern measurements put the figure at approximately 8,849 meters. But in 1856, 8,840 was the number the world had. That still left a second question, one almost as interesting as the height itself. What do you actually call this mountain? The proposal was to name it after one of Britain's most prominent geodesists, a man whose contributions had fundamentally shaped the mapping of the region. The man himself objected. His argument was straightforward. His name couldn't be accurately written or pronounced in local languages, and it simply didn't fit local naming conventions. He didn't want his name plastered onto a mountain that already had names given by the people who actually lived nearby. The colonial administration ignored him entirely. And so Peak 15 received the name we all know today, Mount Everest. This episode is often cited as a textbook example of colonial arrogance, another illustration of how British policy in India routinely disregarded the feelings, traditions, and cultural ownership of local peoples. So there it is, the highest point on Earth, Everest. Standing today at approximately 8,849 meters. But a mountain that tall doesn't just appear overnight. Landscapes change so slowly that on a human timescale, we barely register it at all. Think about a favorite place from your childhood, a gentle meadow, a small hill. After many years, it may look almost identical. Now imagine not years, but millions of years. That's the timescale on which mountains are born. The Himalayas formed as a result of the Indian tectonic plate colliding with the Eurasian plate. That process began roughly 50 million years ago. The chain really started surging upward around 30 million years ago, when one plate began sliding beneath the other, folding and pushing enormous quantities of rock upward into the sky. And Everest doesn't stand alone up there. To its north rises Changsa, which reaches approximately 7,560 meters. Surrounding the main massif are numerous other peaks. To the west and south of Everest, ridges and summits stretch anywhere from over 6,600 to above 7,000 meters. And right next door sits Lhotse, which itself exceeds 8,500 meters. Everest's shape is often described as a three-sided pyramid. Three broad, roughly flat faces form what climbers use as their approach routes, and the edges connecting those faces are the ridges and arêtes that define the mountain's iconic silhouette. And here's the blunt truth. This place is genuinely hostile to human life. Think of the most inhospitable, most dangerous, most resource-barren environment you can picture anywhere on this planet. Now multiply that hostility. The very summit of Everest is covered in hard layers of compacted snow and ice, over which a softer, powdery layer accumulates. That upper snow layer can vary in thickness from year to year by as much as approximately 6 meters of seasonal difference. It typically reaches its maximum depth in September and its minimum in May, driven by seasonal shifts in wind and precipitation patterns. The upper reaches of the mountain sit so high that the oxygen content of the air is dramatically lower than at sea level, roughly 1/3 less than what we breathe at the coast. That oxygen deficit, combined with ferocious winds and temperatures that plunge to extremes far below freezing, makes it impossible for plant or animal life to survive at the summit. Everest is, biologically speaking, completely barren. But that's really just the introduction to the challenges awaiting anyone who dares attempt to climb it. On this mountain, there's no such thing as recreational rock climbing in any conventional sense. Now, let's talk about what it actually means to move through this landscape. We're talking about navigating glaciers, vast, frozen expanses riddled with crevasses and slick with ice. The climate up there is permanently hostile to living things. The warmest average temperature sits at around -19 degrees Celsius, and during the harshest conditions, it can plunge to -60. Sudden blizzards and hurricane-force gusts can hit without warning, with wind speeds regularly exceeding 160 kilometers per hour. For a large part of the year, dense snow falls almost constantly. All of this means that anyone who decides to attempt Everest is risking severe frostbite, the loss of fingers and limbs, and quite possibly their life. But drop down into the valleys and lower reaches of the massif, and the picture changes. Those areas are actually habitable. On the slopes and in the mountain basins, you'll find people who speak Tibetan languages and have called this region home for generations. Among these groups, one stands out in particular: the Sherpas. The Sherpas are a people who have carved out a unique role as mountain guides and high-altitude support workers, and their contribution to expeditions on Everest simply cannot be overstated. Without them, the vast majority of summit attempts would have a drastically lower chance of success. The Sherpas serve as guides, porters, camp suppliers, and route openers through some of the most treacherous sections of the glaciers. But they are also a culture, one whose entire way of life has been shaped over countless generations in the shadow of the world's tallest peaks. Their role in the history of high-altitude mountaineering is genuinely irreplaceable, and the very fact that people have chosen to settle in the valleys at the foot of these mountains says something powerful about the depth of the human connection to the land, no matter how unforgiving that land might be. Sherpa villages are sometimes located at altitudes of up to around 4 kilometers above sea level, for example, in the Khumbu Valley in Nepal, though similar communities exist in other regions as well. Traditionally, the Sherpas sustain themselves through farming on relatively small patches of arable land. Alongside agriculture, for many years they also engaged in trade and lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle. In summer, they would move higher up the mountain slopes in search of pasture, grazing cattle and sheep at elevations approaching nearly 5 kilometers. In winter, they would descend to lower shelters on rocky ledges and along the banks of rivers and streams. Living in the shadow of the highest mountain range on Earth, the Sherpas have long held the Himalayas in deep reverence. At the mountain's base, they built Buddhist monasteries. On the slopes, they hung prayer flags. In the valleys, they created sanctuaries for the local wildlife, including musk deer, various species of pheasants, and Himalayan partridges. Folk beliefs passed down through generations, and in many communities still alive today, hold that gods and spirits dwell in the most distant ridges, and that something mysterious lurks in the mountain crags, the legendary snowman known as the Yeti. For this reason, Sherpas traditionally avoided climbing to the highest slopes unnecessarily, out of both reverence and a deep-rooted fear of the unknown. But globalization eventually found its way even into the remote valleys of the Himalayas. From the early 20th century onward, as British explorers pushed deeper into the region, it became increasingly clear that there were no better candidates for guides and porters than the local people. They were resilient, they knew the terrain intimately, and they understood which places to avoid. The influx of foreign climbers into the Everest region fundamentally transformed Sherpa life. Today, their communities are heavily dependent on tourism and high-altitude expeditions. Yet despite all of this transformation, one core attitude has remained. Many Sherpas still regard an attempt on Everest as an act of extreme recklessness, something comparable to walking into an active volcano. The risk is treated almost like a deliberate step toward death. And even with all the remarkable advances in equipment, transportation, communications, and weather forecasting, Everest has lost none of its terrifying difficulty. Just getting to the base of the mountain is a challenge in itself. The massif sits in a relatively isolated area, and from the Nepalese side, there are no access roads. Right up until the 1960s, all supplies for the approach were carried entirely by hand or by pack animals. Only after the 1960s were airstrips built in the valleys to ease logistical transport, but that did nothing to change the fact that the upper sections of the mountain remain accessible only on foot. On top of all that, a summit attempt on the world's highest peak requires working within very narrow weather windows. There are only 2 short periods each year when atmospheric conditions become even remotely favorable for a summit push. The best window is typically April and May, right before the monsoon arrives. At that point, there's no fresh, soft snow from recent storms, and the avalanche risk is somewhat lower. After the monsoon, a second window opens in September, a few weeks of more cooperative weather, but by October, powerful winter storms begin to dominate and can continue all the way through to March, effectively shutting down any activity on the mountain. And when you add the biological consequences of extreme altitude to all of that, the full picture of what climbers are up against becomes even clearer. Above approximately 7,600 meters, you enter what is known as the death zone. This is the altitude at which the human body simply cannot function without paying a serious price. At that height, appetite drops sharply. The taste of food becomes distorted. Breathing accelerates, heart rate climbs, sleep becomes shallow and fragmented, and the ability to concentrate or think clearly degrades significantly. Oxygen deprivation in the tissues leads to faster exhaustion, and critically, to poor decision-making in an environment where every single mistake can be fatal. This is why climbers use supplemental oxygen bottles. Artificially delivered air can ease some of the symptoms of hypoxia, but it also introduces new dangers. If a climber becomes dependent on an external oxygen supply, and that supply is suddenly cut off during a summit push, the consequences can be catastrophic. And even with oxygen bottles in use, there remain 2 potentially fatal conditions to contend with. The first is high-altitude cerebral edema, where oxygen deficiency causes increased blood flow to the brain, which begins to swell. This can lead to loss of consciousness, coma, and death. The second is high-altitude pulmonary edema, where fluid seeps into the air sacs of the lungs, essentially causing a person to drown in their own body fluids. The most effective treatment for both conditions is the same. Get the affected person down to a lower altitude as quickly as possible, which is, paradoxically, extremely difficult to do, because during a summit attempt, the entire goal is to go up, not down. In light of all of this, high-altitude mountaineering stands as one of the most extreme forms of human activity that exists. There is no middle ground here. In most sports, long-distance running for example, or other physically demanding disciplines, you might get injured, but there's a good chance you'll recover and return to full fitness eventually. Climbing above 8,000 meters almost guarantees some deterioration in your health, and it frequently leaves permanent damage, no exceptions. The conditions are simply incompatible with the human body. And to make things even more complex, there is no single optimal route to the summit. Every path carries its own specific dangers. The southern route, running through the Khumbu Icefall and the South Col, is the most widely chosen by teams attempting Everest. But there is also a northern route, on the Tibetan side of the mountain, which was the approach used by expeditions back in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, one thing that becomes immediately clear when you start looking at the history of Everest expeditions is that this mountain simply cannot be conquered alone. You need a team, a coherent strategy, and an enormously complex logistical plan. And because so many of the early climbers came from military backgrounds, the approach they naturally gravitated toward was something called siege-style climbing. The idea is straightforward. You establish a base camp, then push camps progressively higher and higher up the mountain, building a kind of ladder toward the summit. On the most commonly used southern route, the base camp is typically set up at around 5.5 kilometers above sea level. From there, the expedition pushes additional camps at intervals of roughly 450 meters of elevation gain. Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3. Each one a stepping stone, until you reach the final high camp, positioned approximately 900 meters below the actual summit. That's the launching pad. From that last camp, a small, specially selected group, known as the Summit Assault Team, makes the final push to the top. An undertaking like this requires enormous resources, both in terms of manpower and equipment. And that is precisely where the Sherpas were, and still are, absolutely indispensable. The mountain, for all its terrifying hostility, had an almost magnetic pull the moment it was identified as the highest point on Earth. It triggered an inevitable race. Who would be first to stand on its summit? And honestly, that reaction is deeply human. We are drawn to challenges. We are compelled to do things that others say cannot be done. It's the same impulse that drove early navigators to sail around the entire globe. Think of the captain who led that first circumnavigation of the world, or the fierce competition over who would be the first to set foot at the poles. For the adventurers of that era, the very idea of climbing Everest mattered more than any political prestige attached to it. It was about the challenge itself, and about proving you were capable of meeting it. This obsession started taking organized form surprisingly early. Around 1890, British Army officers were already meeting regularly to sketch out plans for expeditions into the high mountains, including early concepts for tackling Everest. Two of Britain's most prestigious exploration institutions, the Royal Geographical Society and the Alpine Club, began lobbying aggressively for Britain to be the nation that demonstrated it could conquer this mountain. The summit itself had, after all, been named after a British geographer, which gave the whole enterprise a kind of patriotic symbolism that only intensified the drive. Despite a tangle of political complications, the first British reconnaissance expedition finally set out in 1921. It was led by a British officer, and among its members was a man who would become one of the most legendary figures in mountaineering history, George Mallory. The story of this expedition reveals just how grueling even the preparation and approach to Everest was, and how far it exceeded anything resembling a conventional climbing trip. During the summer of 1921, the team conducted a full reconnaissance of the northern approach route. Their goal was to map out a viable way up the mountain from Tibet. But the task turned out to be far harder than anyone had anticipated. Even during the approach march, the team encountered both severe exhaustion and alarming medical emergencies. One member of the expedition died of a heart attack. Another, Rayburn, became seriously ill. Exploration had to be temporarily suspended. None of them had any prior experience with the extreme high-altitude conditions of the Himalayas, so on top of the brutal terrain, they were also battling a climate that was entirely alien to them, something they were encountering for the very first time. Despite these setbacks, the team explored the Rongbuk Valley, crossed onto the Rongbuk Glacier, and pushed up to an altitude of approximately 6,700 meters. They even managed to reach the North Col, though the sheer appearance of that place and the winds howling around it made it clear that it was no place to linger. Powerful gusts ultimately prevented any further ascent. But Mallory used the opportunity to visually trace what appeared to be a possible route all the way to the summit. When the reconnaissance was complete, the team returned to Great Britain. It had been a beginning, a hard-won, often painful beginning, but only a beginning. A year later, in 1922, the British organized another expedition, this time with a clear ambition: attempt the summit before the monsoon arrived. That spring, Sherpas carried the equipment and supplies across the Tibetan plateau. Camps were systematically pushed from base camp up to Camp 3, and with enormous effort, a high-altitude camp was established at approximately 7,600 meters. By mid-May, the weather had started to deteriorate. Even so, several climbers, including Mallory and Norton, pressed higher using oxygen cylinders, reaching approximately 8,200 meters. But conditions continued to worsen. Then came the 7th of June, and it was devastating. Avalanches swept down onto the porters and support groups, sweeping several people off the North Ridge. Multiple Sherpas were killed. Other members of the expedition were dragged downward by cascading snow. Some survived, but they had been placed in immediate mortal danger, and the risk of severe frostbite was very real. That catastrophe ended Britain's second attempt on Everest. 2 years of intensive preparation followed before the next attempt. The third British expedition, which again included Mallory, ran into difficulties almost from the start. Yet despite those obstacles, the team launched what seemed like the most promising summit assault that any British party had ever mounted. In June, Mallory and his partner Andrew Irvine set out from the North Col using supplemental oxygen. In the night between the 6th and 7th of June, both men began the final leg of their climb toward the summit. What happened after that has never been fully resolved, and it remains one of the great mysteries of mountaineering. One of the observers claimed he had spotted 2 climbers somewhere in the area of what's known as the second step on Everest, but later it proved impossible to pin down precisely where and at what time that observation was made. What does seem more certain is that another witness spotted them near the third step at around 12:50 in the afternoon, which, if accurate, would mean they were approximately 150 meters from the summit. But whether Mallory and Irvine actually made it to the top is something no one has ever been able to confirm. What is certain is that neither of them returned to camp. The following day, search parties found no trace of either man. When Mallory had been asked sometime before why he wanted to climb Everest, he gave an answer that has echoed through history ever since. He said he wanted to climb it because it is there. Simple words, but they carry a profound weight, a pure and unadorned expression of why human beings willingly walk toward danger. Mallory paid the ultimate price for that conviction. It wasn't until many decades later, in 1999, that a research expedition finally found his frozen body on the north face of the mountain at approximately 8,200 meters. No camera was found with the remains, no photographs that might have served as definitive proof that he had reached the summit. Also missing was a photograph of his wife, which Mallory had reportedly planned to leave at the top as a personal, symbolic token of his achievement. To this day, the question remains open. Did George Mallory stand on the highest point on Earth that June day in 1924? What is not in doubt is that he died in the pursuit of something he believed was worth dying for. Britain, however, did not walk away. Despite this spectacular and heartbreaking failure, expeditions continued. In 1933, another British team managed to push to approximately 8,350 meters before being forced to turn back. Then, 2 years after that, a carefully organized reconnaissance effort led by experienced explorers carried out detailed surveys of new possible approach routes and studied conditions on the northern slopes in close and systematic detail. So, by the end of July, the team had established a camp on the North Col, but savage avalanche conditions made any further push toward the summit completely out of the question. And in the years that followed, bad luck and unpredictable weather kept getting in the way. One expedition walked straight into the trap of an early monsoon, which killed all progress despite the team having reached the col as early as May. Another started operations too soon and found itself struggling to build camps in brutally deep snow. Because of all that snow and the constant avalanche threat, many groups ended up abandoning their original route and trying alternative lines on the western side of the col instead. In one of those attempts, a 5th camp was established on the 6th of June, and just 2 days later, a team leader pushed forward with 7 Sherpas and set up a 6th camp at close to 8,300 meters above sea level, only to be forced back down by chest-deep snow and rapidly deteriorating weather. That was the story over and over again. Get close, then get beaten back. By 1938, preparations for another serious attempt were already underway. And then the Second World War broke out, and everything stopped. All expedition plans were shelved. When the fighting finally ended, Europe and the rest of the world had very different priorities: rebuilding societies, restructuring economies, dealing with the wreckage of the most destructive conflict in human history. Mountain climbing was simply not on the agenda. On top of that, the British Empire was beginning to come apart at the seams. Britain was now dealing with the consequences of decolonization, one territory after another gaining independence, the old imperial structure crumbling. The British simply could not devote the same level of resources and attention to Himalayan expeditions that they had before the war. The whole context had shifted. Then, in 1952, the Swiss decided to take their own crack at Everest. 2 Swiss expeditions went for the summit. Both failed. What made the second failure even harder to swallow was that it didn't even match the altitude reached by the first, despite the team having more experience. The mountain was proving extraordinarily resistant to every approach. The following years brought more attempts, more failures from both sides of the mountain. Everest was, and in many ways still is, one of the greatest challenges nature has ever placed in front of human beings. But despite that long string of defeats, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Someone was going to reach the top. It was only a matter of time, and of getting the conditions, the team, and the planning right. Through the first half of the 1950s, the competition was intensifying. New expeditions were being planned with the explicit goal of finally finishing the job. The initial thinking for one major British attempt was that it would be led by the most experienced candidate available, a man named Eric. He was the one who had led the 1951 reconnaissance expedition and had made an unsuccessful summit bid the following year. He knew the mountain better than almost anyone. By 1953, preparations were in full swing. Team members were being selected carefully, not just for their raw climbing ability, but for their overall mountain experience and any other practical skills that might prove useful on such a grueling and complex undertaking. The British were determined to finally take on the summit and prove they could do it. But why the sudden urgency in those years specifically? The first British attempt had been 3 decades earlier, and a lot had changed since then. The decolonization process had already cost Britain a significant portion of its former empire. Territories that had existed under British control before the war were now independent nations. The empire was fragmenting, and beyond the geopolitical humiliation of that process, the British were now facing a very specific time pressure. France had been granted permission to attempt Everest in 1954. Switzerland had been approved for 1955. That meant if Britain didn't make its move in 1953, the next available window would be 1956 at the earliest, after both the French and the Swiss had taken their turns. And either of those teams could be the ones to stand on the summit first. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. Miss 1953, and the whole thing might slip away. The British organizers understood this completely. That pressure, combined with some hard thinking about what the expedition actually needed, led to a change in leadership. The expectation had been that the man who conducted the earlier reconnaissance, the one many people in climbing circles respected deeply, would be the natural choice to lead the full expedition. But in the end, the committee went with Colonel John Hunt of the British Army. Hunt himself was reportedly surprised by the appointment. It wasn't the obvious choice, but the circumstances of the task seemed to demand it. Part of why the original candidate was passed over came down to his own words. He had reportedly expressed skepticism about leading a large-scale expedition, saying that he didn't feel drawn to big ventures and that the whole nature of such an undertaking didn't appeal to him. The committee interpreted that as a lack of the drive and determination the moment required. Someone who wasn't fully committed to pushing toward the summit, whatever it took, simply wasn't the right person for this particular mission. What was needed was someone decisive, someone who wouldn't hesitate to change plans, to push the team harder, to keep moving toward the top, even when everything was telling you to turn around. The leadership had to embody an uncompromising attitude. Get to the summit, or don't come back until you're certain there's nothing more you can do. The committee concluded that Hunt had exactly that quality, and that the previous candidate did not. The change wasn't welcomed by everyone. Some of the team members were loyal to the original choice and made no secret of their opposition to the switch. One of the loudest critics, at first, was Edmund Hillary, who was initially one of the strongest voices against Hunt being put in charge. But Hunt's confidence and the force of his personality eventually brought Hillary around, and the team was able to come together fully once the leadership question was settled. With the personnel issues resolved, the focus shifted to building the team and getting into shape. Winter training in Wales began almost immediately, alongside the enormous logistical task of assembling all the equipment the expedition would require. Now, take a moment and imagine you're the one preparing for this. You're getting ready to attempt the highest mountain on Earth. The mission has to succeed. People who went before you died. Others turned back, defeated. What do you bring? What do you decide matters most when your life and the lives of your team depend on the choices you make before you even leave base camp? That question cuts to the heart of one of the deepest lessons high-altitude mountaineering has to teach. This is not a sport where pure physical power wins the day. The highest mountains in the world do not reward blind aggression or the sheer will to keep going without thinking. They punish it. Success at extreme altitude depends on careful planning, on thinking through every phase of the operation in detail, and on applying intelligence precisely where brute force will get you killed. The 1953 expedition had a significantly stronger scientific foundation than any previous attempt on Everest. Understanding of altitude-related physiology had advanced considerably. Knowledge about acclimatization, the effects of reduced atmospheric pressure, how human metabolism functions in thin air, all of it had been refined and was now being applied in a more coordinated way to the practical realities of climbing at extreme elevation. The team drew on research and experience from multiple mountain environments around the world, and the whole undertaking had taken on something close to a national character. Numerous companies provided support, and the organizational scale of the operation was genuinely impressive. That said, there's no single universal checklist you can just run through and declare yourself ready. Every expedition has to prepare for its own specific set of challenges, but in very broad terms, three elements stand out as absolutely critical: oxygen supply, temperature management, and nutrition. The Himalayas impose an extraordinarily wide range of conditions, and any expedition that isn't prepared for extreme fluctuations in all three areas is heading toward frostbite at best and death at worst. One of the defining features of Everest's climate is its wild swings in temperature. Even at altitudes around 6 kilometers, direct sunlight can push air temperatures above freezing. On exposed rock faces, temperatures have been recorded above plus 10 degrees Celsius. Now here's something that sounds almost contradictory, and yet it's one of the most treacherous features of high-altitude mountaineering. In direct sunlight, the temperature can feel almost bearable, but the moment you step into the shade, the water starts to freeze. That combination of deceptive warmth and sudden cold is what makes a mountain like Everest so extraordinarily dangerous. Not in an obvious dramatic way, but in a slow, creeping, exhausting way. At extreme altitude, the air pressure drops significantly, and with it, the humidity plummets. The air becomes incredibly dry, and in those low humidity conditions, temperatures don't just change, they swing wildly and without warning. At the summit of Everest, even in summer, the thermometer typically reads around minus 10 degrees Celsius. But here's the thing. The temperature itself isn't necessarily the most deadly factor up there. The real killer is the wind. When you factor in wind gusts reaching 80 kilometers per hour or more, the felt temperature, what your body actually experiences, drops to something catastrophic. Combine that with the already low air pressure and sub-zero readings, and you've created conditions that are genuinely incompatible with human survival for any extended period. The human body simply wasn't designed for this. So what does all of this mean for clothing? It means the gear has to be extraordinarily versatile. And to understand just how versatile, picture this scenario. You're climbing in full sunshine, working hard, your muscles burning. Sweat starts running down your back. For a moment, it almost feels like plus 10 degrees Celsius, almost pleasant by mountain standards. Then, just a few minutes later, clouds roll in, you step into shadow, and a ferocious gust of wind hits you. The temperature crashes below zero. What felt bearable moments ago is now brutally hostile. And this cycle repeats over and over again throughout a single day. That kind of relentless fluctuation breaks people. It doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it actively works against your body's ability to regulate heat. Sweating throws off your thermal insulation. It forces you to stop and change layers, which takes time and energy you can't afford to waste. And it depletes your body's reserves of fluids and electrolytes, which at altitude are already desperately hard to replenish. There's another sneaky problem: solar radiation. Even at altitudes close to 8,000 meters, sunlight is intense enough to melt snow. And melting snow means wet boots. Wet boots provide almost no insulation against the cold. And at night, those wet boots can freeze solid, literally turning into blocks of ice around your feet. That's not an inconvenience, that's a medical emergency waiting to happen. Above 6,000 meters, the weight of your equipment becomes absolutely critical. The success or failure of an entire expedition can hinge on whether the team managed to carry enough supplies up to the higher camps. Expedition commanders learn this lesson through painful experience. If a pack is too heavy, climbers start abandoning gear. And abandoned gear doesn't just mean discomfort, it means direct risk to life. During the 1953 British expedition to Everest, the clothing and equipment, boots, gloves, and the rest, typically weighed around 10 kilograms. Through careful preparation and extensive testing, that weight was brought down to approximately 7.5 kilograms. That reduction wasn't cosmetic. Every gram shaved off made a genuine difference at altitude. The outer layers, windproof jackets and trousers, were made from a fabric similar to that used in tent manufacturing, a blend of cotton and nylon. The primary job of these outer layers wasn't warmth, it was wind resistance. Because wind is responsible for the greatest heat loss in mountain conditions, get the wind protection right and everything else becomes more manageable. Cut and fit also received serious attention. Clothing that's too tight restricts movement and compresses the insulating layer of air that sits between fabric and skin, eliminating the very thing that keeps you warm. But clothing that's too loose lets the wind in and destroys the efficiency of your insulation. Getting that balance right was a genuine engineering challenge. For insulation, the team used down-filled jackets and trousers. Down is remarkably light for the warmth it provides, which is exactly what you need at altitude. But it has one critical flaw. When down gets compressed, it loses a large portion of its insulating properties almost instantly. Because of this, the expedition didn't rely solely on down suits. They also carried soft trousers reminiscent of pajama bottoms, down vests, and multiple layers of sweaters, allowing climbers to build up or strip away layers as conditions demanded, rather than bedding everything on a single garment. Footwear above 6,000 meters got special, dedicated attention. At those heights, the priorities were clear: low weight, resistance to moisture, and maximum warmth. The energy cost of heavy boots at altitude is staggering, and there's a fascinating calculation behind it. Every additional half kilogram carried on your feet is roughly equivalent, in terms of physical effort, to carrying 2 kilograms on your back. So reducing boot weight by even a small amount translates into real, measurable savings in energy expenditure. And over the course of a long summit push, that adds up to an enormous difference in team performance. For shelter, the expedition chose 2-person tents with an A-frame pole design. These structures could be pitched very quickly even in strong winds, which at altitude is not a luxury, it's a survival requirement. However, during the day, these tents could become uncomfortably hot in the Himalayan sun. To address that, additional ventilation openings were added, along with a second entrance to improve airflow and make daily life inside the tent more manageable as weather conditions shifted. One detail of the clothing that proved particularly effective: zipped cuffs at the wrists. They kept driving snow out during storms and blizzards, while also allowing ventilation during warmer stretches of climbing. Simple, practical, and highly effective. Exactly the kind of solution that makes the difference between surviving and not. And then there's the sleeping system. Sleeping bags and inflatable mattresses were considered essential kit, not optional extras. In the high Himalaya, with temperatures swinging so violently, double sleeping bags became practically mandatory. To provide a single climber with an acceptable level of insulation, roughly 5 kilograms of down was required. The bags also had to be long enough to pull up over the head entirely and wide enough to allow the occupant to roll over without a struggle. The inner lining was made from a slippery fabric, specifically to make changing position easier. This might sound trivial, it is absolutely not. At extreme altitude, where oxygen is desperately scarce, even the simple act of rolling over in a sleeping bag demands significant physical effort and can trigger breathlessness. Think about that for a moment, gasping for breath in your sleep, not because something is wrong with you medically, but simply because the air is so thin that moving while lying down taxes your respiratory system. That's how demanding the environment is. Just as with down clothing, a sleeping bag loses its insulating power when it gets compressed against a hard surface. The bottom of the bag gets squashed flat and stops working. The solution was the inflatable mattress, providing that critical extra layer of insulation between the climber and the ground, keeping the down lofted and functional. Now, let's shift from what the climbers wore and slept in to what they ate, because feeding a team through weeks of high-altitude effort is its own enormous challenge. Anyone who's ever come home after a long day of hiking knows that particular feeling, a deep, almost aggressive hunger that takes hold of your whole body. Your muscles ache, your energy reserves feel completely emptied out, and your body is essentially demanding fuel with no subtlety whatsoever. Now multiply that feeling by weeks of effort at extreme altitude in brutal cold, with every step costing double the energy it would at sea level. One of the oldest and most persistent problems in high-altitude mountaineering is the physical deterioration that sets in as altitude increases. Beyond a certain point, climbers begin to experience a cascade of problems: creeping exhaustion that never fully lifts, impaired recovery, loss of appetite, weight loss, and a steady decline in physical performance. The numbers here are stark and unforgiving. At around 6,000 meters above sea level, the human body can survive and function, with difficulty, for up to roughly 5 weeks. At 7,300 meters, that window shrinks to approximately 10 days. Above 8,000 meters, the so-called death zone, the maximum safe exposure is around 3 days. After that, the body begins to consume itself, and the damage becomes irreversible. For a long time, researchers suspected that a major part of this deterioration was caused by inadequate intake of energy and fluids, and the historical record backs this up. A participant in one of the early Everest expeditions in the 1930s kept detailed notes on food consumption during the climb. His records show that above 5,000 meters, daily calorie intake fell to around 2,000 kilocalories. Above 6,500 meters, it dropped further, to roughly 1,500 kilocalories per day. That was drastically insufficient. 1,500 kilocalories is barely enough for a sedentary adult sitting at a desk. For a person fighting their way up the world's highest mountain in sub-zero temperatures and gale force winds, it's nowhere close to what the body needs. And the consequences were predictable. Expedition members were losing an average of around 13 kilograms of body mass over the course of a climb. 13 kilograms. That's not weight loss, that's the body burning itself for fuel. In the early 1950s, the British organizers of Everest expeditions took a much closer look at nutrition at each stage of the climb. During the typical 3-week acclimatization march that preceded the actual ascent, the daily eating pattern revolved around 2 main meals, breakfast and dinner. Breakfast followed a broadly European format: cereals, eggs, bacon, jam, butter, and hard biscuits. Dinner usually meant a plate of rice or potatoes with a small portion of fried meat or a piece of chicken. During the march itself, snacks consisted of sweets and chocolate. Fluids were taken. And almost all of that fluid intake came in the form of hot drinks, mostly tea. Some climbers were drinking as much as 4 liters of the stuff every single day. But once the team pushed above 5,500 meters, appetites started to crater. And cooking became a genuine nightmare, because up there you simply didn't have the right pots, pans, or heating gear to prepare proper meals. That made the calorie problem even worse. Daily energy intake dropped sharply, down to just a few thousand calories, and a significant chunk of even that modest total was coming from sweetened drinks alone. Average sugar consumption per person reached as high as 350 grams a day. Think about that for a second. That's an enormous amount of sugar, and it was basically keeping people functional. On top of all this, climbers started experiencing intense, almost obsessive cravings for very specific foods, things that were completely impossible to get at that altitude. Some dreamed about salmon. Others couldn't stop thinking about canned fruit. Some wanted sausages or sauerkraut. And a surprising number of people would have traded almost anything just for eggs. One climber's notes reveal that at nearly 7,000 meters, fluid consumption climbed to almost 7 liters per day. That's a staggering amount of liquid that has to come from somewhere, and above the snow line, every single drop had to be melted from snow and ice. That put enormous pressure on the expedition's stoves and heating equipment. The melting devices had to be extraordinarily efficient just to keep every team member adequately hydrated. From all of this, the organizers drew some very concrete conclusions going into the next attempt. Lesson 1. You need enormous reserves of sugar and fast-absorbing carbohydrates at altitude. Lesson 2. You have to find a way to satisfy those specific food cravings the climbers develop. And this wasn't just about making people feel comfortable. It was about keeping morale from collapsing entirely. When people are utterly exhausted, they slip into apathy faster than you'd think. And once they reach that state, they'd sooner skip a meal entirely than force themselves to eat something they genuinely can't stand. The moment climbers stop eating, their physical condition deteriorates rapidly, and that happens independently of whatever the altitude is already doing to their bodies. So the food has to be something people actually want to eat. That's not a luxury, that's a survival requirement. With all of that hard-won experience in mind, the leadership planning the 1953 expedition made a bold decision. They would break with the old tradition of preparing meals from loose, separate ingredients carried up the mountain in bulk. Instead, nearly all the food would be packed into pre-assembled daily rations. Each ration was a complete package containing everything a single climber needed for one full day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, the works, all bundled together in one box. You open the package and there's your entire day of food, sorted and ready to go. This system had some serious advantages. It allowed the team to bring familiar European flavors that the climbers actually enjoyed. It massively simplified distribution and logistics on the mountain. It reduced losses caused by individual items getting lost or spoiled, and it eliminated the risk of reaching a high camp only to discover that some critical ingredient had been left behind or used up. In short, it made feeding an expedition at extreme altitude far more manageable. For the camps above approximately 6,500 meters, where every single gram of weight and every cubic centimeter of space was absolutely critical, the team developed a second, stripped-down version called assault rations. These were designed for the final push. The standard camp ration contained a full daily menu, typically 5 varieties of meat or fish, 4 types of vegetables, fruit, cake, jam, butter, chocolate, and various other items. Dry and soft goods like sugar, tea, and powdered milk were packed separately. The assault ration, by contrast, was laser-focused on pure, high-energy essentials: sugar, powdered milk, biscuits, sweets, and lemonade powder. Everything you need for a short but brutally intense summit attempt. These items were packed into plastic bags and vacuum sealed, which dramatically reduced the overall bulk and weight of the load. But then there was one more touch, and this one is particularly clever. To give morale one final boost and add a genuinely personal element to the summit attempt, the planners decided that each climber could bring one favorite personal treat, a so-called special ration, to be opened immediately before the final push to the top. Someone chose sardines, someone else chose canned fruit. Another person chose a particular type of special chocolate they loved. Just imagine the scene for a moment. You're standing at the edge of your physical limits, roughly 8 kilometers above sea level. The final assault is right in front of you, and you open a small package and catch the smell of something that reminds you of home. An instant hit of comfort, a sudden surge of psychological strength. That simple little idea mattered enormously. And here's a delightful footnote. The single most popular drink accompanying summit attempts turned out to be lemonade. It was so sweet, so heavily sweetened, that the 1953 expedition was actually nicknamed the Lemonade Expedition by some. The extreme sweetness wasn't accidental, it was necessary. At high altitude, your sense of taste weakens considerably, so drinks had to be prepared with as much as 100 grams of sugar per cup just to produce any noticeable sweetness at all. Now, before we move forward, it's worth stepping back to an earlier moment in this story. Back in 1922, the medical officers accompanying the earliest attempts on the highest peaks had drawn a line in the sand. Their view at the time was that approximately 7,600 meters represented a practical physiological ceiling, the altitude above which the human body simply could not function normally. And at high altitude, things change in ways that are genuinely dramatic. Later experience proved that relying solely on your own body above that threshold was a serious mistake. On the summit of Everest, atmospheric pressure, and therefore air density, drops to roughly 1/3 of what it is at sea level. And remember, oxygen makes up about 1/5 of the air we breathe. The result is a severe oxygen deficit that directly impairs brain function, and that is the single greatest danger facing any high-altitude climber. When the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, you start experiencing symptoms that closely resemble alcohol intoxication. You feel an irrational, unfounded sense of confidence. Your awareness of risk diminishes. Your balance deteriorates. Your coordination breaks down. On the near vertical slopes of a mountain nearly 9 kilometers high, any one of these effects can be fatal. So here's the situation, stated plainly as a piece of good news and a piece of bad news. The good news: these symptoms can be significantly reduced by breathing supplemental oxygen from pressurized cylinders. The bad news: you have to carry those cylinders with you up the mountain, and using them requires a proper oxygen mask. For the Everest expedition, 2 types of oxygen apparatus were under serious consideration. The first was the open-circuit system. In an open-circuit setup, the climber inhales a mixture of ambient air and oxygen fed from the cylinder, and then exhales directly into the atmosphere. The downside of this approach is significant. Only a small fraction of the oxygen being delivered is actually absorbed by the body. The rest is simply breathed out and lost. That's wasteful by any measure. However, the open-circuit design has real practical advantages. It's mechanically simple, it's easy to use, and it's reliable. In functional terms, it's essentially a tube that pulls oxygen from the bottle and delivers it straight to your mouth and nose. Straightforward and robust. The closed-circuit systems are a completely different story, far more sophisticated in their engineering. Their key advantage is that there is no connection to the outside atmosphere. The gas the climber inhales and exhales circulates entirely within a sealed loop. Carbon dioxide produced during exhalation is chemically absorbed by a canister filled with sodium carbonate, a substance commonly called soda lime. This means oxygen is used far more efficiently, and the climber can breathe more fully and deeply without wasteful losses. So which system do you choose for the 1953 assault on Everest? The answer was a practical compromise. The majority of the expedition's oxygen equipment consisted of open-circuit systems, reliable and proven. But a small number of closed-circuit sets were also brought along on a trial basis to test their performance in real summit conditions. The gear was assembled, the food was ready and packed, the team was complete. All that remained was to actually go. On the 12th of February 1953, the expedition departed England and set course for Nepal. In Kathmandu, the group was looked after by the British diplomatic representative, who arranged accommodation for the climbers with staff at the embassy. In early March, the team of porters selected by the local Himalayan club arrived in the city, men chosen specifically to help carry loads through the western Khum and up toward the South Col. And leading them was a Sherpa with a formidable reputation that preceded him everywhere he went. Tenzing Norgay. Remember that name. He was, at that point, one of the most respected and accomplished Sherpas and mountaineers of his entire generation. And in the expedition secretary's notes, we find a detailed account of what the plan actually called for. The plan's greatest strength was its obsessive attention to detail. Every single element had been worked out with cold, methodical logic, from the exact number of tents needed at the South Col to the precise deadlines for dispatching oxygen cylinders up the mountain. The core assumptions of the plan read roughly like this. The assault group should consist of 10 climbers plus a doctor. Before any climbing could begin, the team needed to undergo a serious, structured acclimatization process. The goal of that preparation was to make absolutely sure that every single member of the expedition could live and function at altitudes around 6,400 meters without any deterioration in their health, and then push that threshold even further, up to 6,500 meters. An advanced base camp was to be established at the top of the western combe, and from there, the direct assault on the summit would be launched and coordinated. Further entries in the expedition diary made one point crystal clear. Everything above the advanced base camp had to be completely subordinated to a single purpose, ensuring that every member of the team performed their assigned role at the moment of the actual summit bid. Climbers designated for the final push were expected to focus entirely on the ascent itself, not on exploring the surrounding terrain. Adequate supplies had to be stockpiled at the South Col to support the summit teams from below. The highest camp was to be placed as close to the summit as physically possible, ideally at around 8,500 meters. And the expedition secretary closed his notes with one straightforward observation. The chances of success would increase dramatically if supplemental oxygen was used consistently and with total commitment. There was no room for improvisation anywhere in this plan. Everything was scheduled down to the hour. The gear was moved by cable car. From there, Indian Army sappers organized onward transport to the eastern end of the valley. At that point, around 350 porters, known as coolies, were recruited to carry supplies. That's an enormous number of people, and on narrow mountain trails, a column that size becomes genuinely unwieldy. So the group was split into two separate parties. Just stop and picture that for a moment. Leading a column of 350 people, each one carrying a heavy load, moving through winding mountain paths. That kind of operation demands extraordinary organizational discipline. But the preparation was solid, the logistics were in place, and after all that groundwork, there was only one thing left to do: start climbing. From the 10th of March. While the last commemorative photographs were still being taken, long lines of porters began moving through the narrow lanes of the small town. That was the first stage of a 17-day journey to the place known as Tengboche, sometimes transcribed as Tiangboche. The very next day, a march gaining around 1,200 meters of altitude brought the group to a wide campsite stretched across a grassy ridge. They walked the ridge in the morning hours. In the wake of a recent storm, the air had been scrubbed clean, and the Himalayas, including the full massif of Everest, appeared with startling sharpness, as if someone had pressed the focus on the entire world. That night was spent in a small, lively village. Inside a local Buddhist monastery, restoration work was underway. Intricate allegorical murals covered the walls in vivid color. A painter had been brought in specifically for the task and had already been working on them for over a year. After that, the route led upward across broad hillsides, offering sweeping views across to the summit of Malungtse. The expedition was fortunate to be traveling just ahead of the monsoon. The second group, which had passed through about 2 weeks earlier, had not been treated to views like these. The daily rhythm of the march settled into something almost meditative: breaking camp at dawn, 3 hours of walking during the best part of the day, a stop beside a river for a wash, the cook preparing a generous breakfast, and then the long afternoon stretch continuing onward. The pace was deliberately unhurried. The porters rarely covered more than around 15 kilometers in a single day, which allowed everyone to genuinely appreciate the landscapes around them and to ease gradually into the physical demands ahead. The hillsides were decorated with blazing red rhododendrons and creamy white magnolias. Orchards were in full bloom. The weather was cool but forgiving, and the camps were set in spots of real beauty. Before long, the expedition moved into the country of the Sherpas, and the views became even more extraordinary. The Sherpas themselves seemed to be enjoying the journey just as much as the rest of the team, and that shared enthusiasm lifted the mood of the entire column considerably. They were also receiving fair wages for their work, which made a real difference. The long days of marching were serving a double purpose: conditioning the team's bodies for the demands of load carrying at altitude, and field testing the oxygen masks. It quickly became clear that the engineer who had designed those masks had done exceptional work. You could sprint uphill wearing one, or sleep through the night with the mask on your face, and feel no restriction in your breathing whatsoever. After 13 days of walking, the expedition reached the heart of Sherpa country. Every day of marching brought them deeper into more and more spectacular terrain. Valley walls gradually rose to around 1,500 meters above the canyon floors, and white-tipped peaks topping 6,000 meters began appearing on all sides. On the 26th of March, 1953, the expedition reached Tengboche. The porters had performed magnificently, hundreds of kilograms of equipment delivered intact without a single loss. A few days of rest followed, and there, in the full blaze of the sun, roughly 20 kilometers ahead, the target came into view, the summit of Everest. Expedition accounts describe the massif as forming a vast, powerful arm rising above an immense southern wall. That was the place toward which all the months of work, planning, and sheer determination had been directed. The expedition's narrator described the landscape in vivid, almost poetic terms. In one passage, he writes about what lay before them. To the right, rising in splendid isolation, was Ama de Blam, a breathtaking, steeply angled pinnacle of rock and ice, ringed by vertical cliffs on every side, looking utterly impregnable. In the early morning, the first rays of sunlight cut straight through its thin, gleaming ice ridges. On the opposite side of the valley, rock spires and further snow-capped peaks emerged from the shadows, and completing the scene was a small village settlement which, under Buddhist teaching and tradition, had effectively become a kind of wildlife sanctuary. Pheasants, chickens, and roosters wandered freely around the tents. Musk deer could be seen at close range, barely concerned by human presence. The local people were extraordinarily welcoming, and the lamas received the visitors with great hospitality. The Sherpas were given the traditional blessing. Members of the expedition were offered tea, and the monk serving as the monastery's abbot shared a story from 2 winters before, when, he said, a yeti had appeared in the area. He pointed through the window to the exact places where tracks had reportedly been found, where the creature had apparently been searching for food, and where it had been seen basking on the rocks in the sun. Whether you believe the story or not, it made for a memorable evening. After 3 thoroughly enjoyable days, in early April of 1953, the teams were divided into 3 separate groups for the first phase of acclimatization. The time had come to establish base camp and begin pushing progressively higher with each successive rotation. But before any of that could happen, the expedition had to deal with its first truly serious obstacle, the Khumbu Glacier, and the infamous icefall that spreads across it. Why does that particular section of the route have a reputation as one of the most dangerous places on the entire mountain? The word icefall barely captures what it actually is. This is not some modest stretch of a small glacier, nor a short but treacherous passage. The Khumbu is a vast river of ice that grinds its way down the slopes of Everest at a rate of roughly 1 meter every single day. That constant movement, combined with the dramatically falling angle of the terrain, causes enormous transverse blocks of ice to fracture away from the upper sections and tumble downward, creating gaping crevasses in their wake. Those crevasses can be more than 20 meters wide and drop down for tens of meters into the darkness below. Try to picture falling into that kind of void. But the danger doesn't stop there. As those multi-ton segments of ice continue their slow, unstoppable, grinding descent, the pressure builds and twists the ice into increasingly complex and unpredictable formations, crushing and shattering it under forces that are almost beyond imagination. Now, one of the most treacherous sections of the entire route isn't some dramatic summit ridge or a knife-edge arête high in the death zone. It's a chaotic, grinding, groaning river of ice sitting right at the beginning of the climb. And the deeper into the Khumbu icefall you go, the more hostile the landscape becomes. In the middle section of the icefall, enormous crevasses slash across the terrain. Lower down, smaller ice blocks are jumbled together in what looks almost like a giant's game of pickup sticks, completely random, completely unstable. Beneath the snow, treacherous snow bridges hide deep cracks in the ice, just waiting to swallow an unsuspecting climber. And hanging above the whole thing, like executioners' axes frozen in mid-swing, are the seracs, enormous ice towers and overhanging walls, some of them weighing several thousand tons, that can collapse without the slightest warning. If you're standing underneath one of those ice walls when a serac lets go or an avalanche releases, your options are essentially zero. Everything falls nearly straight down, and there is nowhere to hide. The passage through the Khumbu icefall is so genuinely dangerous that even the elaborate systems of fixed ropes and aluminum ladders that the Sherpa teams install season after season don't eliminate the possibility of catastrophe. In 2016, 44 expedition members lost their lives in this very area. Let that number sink in. 44 people. That single statistic tells you everything you need to know about the scale of the threat. So is there any way to reduce the risk at all? Experienced climbers do everything they can to pass through the icefall before dawn. In the cold of the night, temperatures drop enough to stiffen the ice, slowing down its constant movement. But once the sun climbs above the horizon and starts warming the surface, everything changes. The ice begins to melt, even just slightly. The friction between the layers decreases, the glacier picks up speed, crevasses widen, and the seracs become even less stable than they already were. The most dangerous window is around midday. A fit, well-acclimatized climber can get through the icefall in a few hours. Someone less experienced or not yet adapted to the altitude might spend half a day picking their way through the chaos. The first camp on the route, heading through the south col of Everest, was traditionally placed just above the highest sections of the icefall. The struggle with this section of the mountain began on the 12th of April when one of the groups set up camp at the foot of the icefall, on the lower reaches of the glacier. The very next day they pushed forward to scout the terrain. What they found was not encouraging. Since 1951, the icefall had changed considerably, and changed for the worse. After trying several possible routes, the team settled on a central line through the ice, but there was no real escape from the hazards of the icefall itself. The steep ground below the camp was covered in jagged, misshapen blocks of ice of all different sizes, jutting up at every angle. Scattered among these frozen towers were multi-ton chunks with deep crevasses and cracks running between them, many of them hidden under a deceptively smooth layer of fresh snow. The larger gaps were bridged using aluminum ladders, which were later replaced by tree trunks that the Sherpa porters hauled up from the forests below. At several key points along the route, fixed ropes were anchored to give climbers something to hold on to. Two sections of the route were so brutally steep and demanding that they earned their own grim nicknames. The climbers called them Horror 1 and Horror 2. A temporary camp was pitched on the edge of an ice platform that could only be reached by crossing shifting crevasse fields and unreliable ice blocks. At night, the camp was never quiet. The ice groaned, cracked, and thundered around the tents, and on more than one occasion, crevasses began to open up directly beneath the pitched shelters. The Sherpa team, understandably shaken by the constant and terrifying noise, refused to keep sleeping there, and the camp had to be relocated. A little higher up, the most reliable path, imperfect but the best available, turned out to be a route along the right side of the icefall, where enormous masses of ice moving in from the west hadn't yet fractured into smaller fragments. The route eventually ended up threading between gigantic ice blocks that looked like frozen icebergs. From there, the climbers tackled a roughly 40-meter vertical wall by working their way through a narrow ice crack. At the top of that block, a slender ice bridge connected them to the western Khum beyond. On the 22nd of April, 1953, Camp 3 was established at an altitude of approximately 6,000 meters above sea level. At the same time, the team was continuously building out the infrastructure of the route, installing more fixed ropes, threading lines through crevasses, and placing additional route markers so that heavily loaded porters could find their way through the maze. Every group of porters moving up through the icefall would carve the footsteps deeper and pack the snow tighter. Gradually, a well-worn trail emerged, a wide main artery through the ice that, in good conditions, could be walked from base camp to Camp 3 in as little as 3 hours. But decent conditions were hard to come by in those weeks leading up to mid-May. Fresh snow fell nearly every single day, and every morning the team had to dig out and clear the route from scratch, which at that altitude was an enormous physical effort. Meanwhile, the rest of the expedition was making its way to base camp, bringing up supplies and equipment. The whole operation required a carefully coordinated effort involving many people at once. Some teams were ferrying loads higher up the mountain, others were maintaining and securing the route, and still others were organizing and managing the stockpiles of equipment and food at the camps below. On the 24th of April, after a 2-day rest at base camp, the first teams went back to work and began carrying loads further up through the icefall. It was estimated that getting roughly 4 tons of essential supplies up to the higher camps would take close to 3 weeks, and that's almost exactly how long it took. Despite worsening snowfall and the first cases of illness appearing among the team, the group stuck to the schedule. After 10 days of continuous work, the expedition leader agreed to give everyone 2 days off. The rest was taken at a pasture on the edge of the glacier, about a 2-hour walk below base camp. The break paid real dividends. The persistent coughing fits that had plagued the Sherpa members began to ease, and morale across the team improved significantly. On the 1st of May, the expedition leader and one of his trusted colleagues established Camp 4 at an altitude of approximately 6,400 meters. But the weather had other ideas. Temperatures dropped further, and the relentless heavy snowfall made the daily job of uncovering and re-establishing the route more difficult with each passing day. At that altitude, every task demands more from the body than it would at sea level, and even routine physical work becomes a genuine test of endurance. As the carry operation progressed, the expedition's attention inevitably shifted to the next major obstacle waiting ahead: the Lhotse face. The western face of Lhotse is one of those features that stops you in your tracks the first time you see it. It's a colossal wall of ice and snow that stands in the way of anyone trying to reach Everest via the South Col route. We're talking about a near-vertical ice wall rising approximately 1,125 meters, angled at close to 50 degrees, and that's just the average. At the steepest sections, the angle of the ice ramps up to nearly 80 degrees, creating near-vertical overhangs and ice bulges that push even experienced high-altitude climbers to the absolute limit of their technical ability. The Sherpa teams working at these elevations had the task of fixing permanent lines across the glaciated sections so that the climbers and load carriers behind them could move upward with some degree of safety. The technique required to ascend those fixed ropes at altitude is highly specific, a precise, disciplined rhythm of kicking a foothold into the ice and pulling yourself up the rope, repeated over and over for hours on end. In the upper part of the face, 2 rocky outcroppings broke up the otherwise relentless ice, a feature known as the Yellow Band, and another called the Geneva Spur. These 2 formations offered some variation in the otherwise monotonous and punishing ice climbing. A reconnaissance team, equipped with closed-circuit oxygen apparatus, set out from Camp 4 to probe the route. On their first day out from camp, they tested the terrain ahead, and the following day, a second pair of climbers followed in their tracks. Despite terrible conditions caused by relentless snowfall, the teams managed to reach the upper part of the steep glacier and climb as high as approximately 6,900 meters before returning to Camp 4. The next day, Camp 5 was established at around 6,700 meters. While this was happening, the expedition leadership sent one of the team members back down to base camp, accompanied by 2 Sherpa climbers who had fallen ill. The remaining team, supported by their assistants, pressed the reconnaissance further upward. They reached approximately 7,000 meters, where on a narrow rocky ledge they managed to pitch a single tent. This bare, exposed shelter became Camp 6. The going had become extraordinarily grueling by this point. Constant snowfall, driving gusts of wind, and falling temperatures made navigation an exhausting ordeal, and finding the right line through the mountain's upper terrain demanded every last bit of concentration and willpower the climbers had left. And all the while, the next major obstacle was drawing closer, relentlessly, inevitably: the South Col. Now, the South Col is a sharp, saddle-shaped section of ridge that connects the main mountain to an adjoining stretch of terrain. It sits between the highest summit and the neighboring peak, and because it's constantly scoured by ferocious winds, very little snow ever settles there. This was typically where expeditions making their push from the southeast ridge would set up their final high camp before the ultimate summit bid. And once you cross the South Col, you enter what climbers call the death zone. Up here, altitude sickness stops being a theoretical risk and becomes a very real, very lethal one. Even sleep becomes difficult. Your digestive system slows down or shuts off entirely. Your body is running so dangerously low on reserves that it simply stops bothering to process new food. From the moment a climber reaches the South Col, most switch to supplemental oxygen, and they have just 2, maybe 3 days at absolute maximum to make their summit push. If the weather turns during that window, if the skies cloud over and the winds pick up, the entire team has to retreat, often all the way back to base camp. Getting back up to the col for a second attempt is rare. Those 2 or 3 days are, in almost every case, the whole ballgame. During one of the key operational windows, on the 21st of May 1953, several climbing teams reached the South Col at an altitude of approximately 7,906 meters. That move opened the door to the final assault on the summit. Expedition leadership now selected the pair of climbers who would lead the first attempt. From this moment on, Everest stopped being a hazy silhouette on the far horizon. It became a real, tangible cone of snow and ice that was actually climbable. The first pair was equipped with closed-circuit oxygen systems. These devices were more efficient in terms of oxygen delivery, but they were also heavier and less comfortable to use than the open-circuit models. Their instructions were clear: get to the south summit if at all possible, and if oxygen supplies, strength, and time allowed, push from there to the true highest point. The south summit sits only about 100 meters below the absolute top of the mountain, which sounds on paper like almost nothing. But at that altitude, every single step requires a colossal expenditure of effort. After one step forward, a climber might need to stop and take 6 full breaths before being physically capable of taking the next one. 6 breaths for one step. In the early morning of the 26th of May 1953, at 5 in the morning, sunlight stirred the 2 climbers awake. By 6 o'clock, they had sipped diluted drinks, pulled on their high-altitude boots, and headed outside to carefully inspect their oxygen apparatus in the open air. Just a brief exposure of bare hands to the wind or accidental contact with any metal surface brought instant numbness and frostbite. One of them, alarmed by how quickly his fingers went dead, retreated back into the tent, and soon discovered that the valves on his oxygen set had frozen solid overnight. The inlet tap had seized in the closed position, and the gas had stopped flowing completely. Fortunately, despite cuts on his hands that were already bleeding from the cold, he managed to carry out a makeshift repair on the tubing. By 7:30, the pair was moving upward. Each man was carrying more than 25 kilograms of equipment on his back. Despite the load, they kept pushing forward, eventually reaching the steep tongue of snow and ice that led up onto the southeast ridge. The snow was hard and compacted, and they were forced to laboriously cut steps into it, a process that ate up enormous amounts of time on each pitch. Above them, dark clouds were building, though patches of sunlight still broke through in places. They looked down, and far below spotted tiny orange dots, the tents of Camp 7. They paused briefly, then carried on. For a long stretch, they moved along the left side of the ridge, picking their way across loose rock barely covered by a thin, unstable layer of soft snow, using their hands almost constantly. Standing fully upright was out of the question. Even trying risked peeling away from the face entirely. Eventually, they reached the point where the true frozen snowfield began, at around 8,500 meters. Around 11 in the morning, they found a small hollow in the slope that offered a moment's shelter from the biting wind. One of them decided this was the right place to swap out an oxygen canister. The exchange went smoothly, but that's when they discovered a different, deeply unwelcome problem. The bottle containing their drink, the famous lemonade they'd carried up, hadn't survived the cold. The glass had cracked. The liquid had spilled out and was now mixed hopelessly into the snow. There was no time and no energy to dwell on it. They tossed the broken bottle down the south face and kept climbing. About 10 minutes later, one of the oxygen sets started failing. The canisters still had plenty of gas in it. That wasn't the problem. The device had simply stopped delivering air. They couldn't find an obvious explanation. No visible cracks, no straightforward mechanical fault. After examining it as best they could, they concluded that the chemical filling inside the closed-circuit system had given out. The carbon dioxide absorption cartridge had likely lost its effectiveness, and carbon dioxide was now building up inside the circuit, causing a choking sensation that got worse the more they climbed. Despite all of this, at 1 in the afternoon, they reached the south summit. The true top of the world was now only about 100 meters away. But time and oxygen were merciless. When they ran the numbers, they found that the remaining oxygen supply would last barely 2.5 hours, just enough to get them back down to the South Col. There was nothing left in reserve for a push to the highest point. The two men looked at each other. No words were needed. Both understood perfectly. Ambition had to bow to clear-eyed survival instinct. Everest had beaten the first team. They took a few photographs, stood in silence for a brief moment, and began their descent. On the way down, snow began creeping inside their boots, making them heavy and throwing off their balance on the steep slopes. Lower down, below the upper rock bands, the clouds thickened and closed in. Moisture began freezing on their goggle lenses. Even without goggles, visibility dropped to just a few meters. They sat down beside the oxygen bottles they'd cached earlier, eating snow and glucose tablets, trying to summon whatever strength remained. The ridge became treacherously steep, and beneath their feet lay a shifting, unreliable layer of loose snow. Both men slipped more than once. At one point, one of the climbers lost his footing and collided with the other, and together they slid dozens of meters down the face. His partner desperately drove his ice axe into rock and snow, fighting to arrest the fall. Eventually, they stopped. For several long minutes, they could do nothing but breathe, gasping hard, before it was possible to continue. Exhausted, frozen through, and barely functioning, they finally dropped below the cloud line. When the camp at the col came into view, they could make out a handful of figures moving around between the tents. The snow gave way at last to dry, wind-blasted patches of glacier and stone ledges. Step by step, placing each foot with enormous care, they made their way in. Their teammates came out to meet them, wrapped arms around them without a word of question, and helped them under the shelter of a tent to get warm. The mood in the camp was heavy. The news that the first summit attempt had failed hit everyone hard. It meant only one pair remained, one last team that could still make a bid for the top, a group that had initially been treated as the backup option, and yet one that many in the expedition quietly believed might be the real, genuine hope of reaching the summit. When the two returning climbers gathered around the stove and began describing what had happened, how they had actually made it all the way to the south summit, what they had seen, what had gone wrong, so let's pick up right where things were getting really intense. The first pair had already turned back and reported what they'd encountered near the top, problems with oxygen cylinders, and a ridge leading to the highest point that looked, by their description, brutally exposed and technically demanding. Not long after that debrief, the expedition launched its second attempt. This time, the assault pair consisted of an experienced mountaineer from New Zealand and a local Sherpa guide from Nepal. These two were going to push all the way to the summit. The night before their decisive push, one of them lay in his sleeping bag, unable to fully relax. The forecast wasn't promising. On the 27th of May, winds at the South Col were so ferocious they literally made any upward movement impossible. But there was a silver lining. The previous pair had already cut steps into the hard, steep snow. By following in their footsteps, the new team could conserve energy and move more efficiently. Despite the crushing weight of their packs, things were going reasonably well. At around 8,300 meters, they came across a cache of supplies left by other expedition members a few days earlier. They weren't thrilled about adding even more weight to their already overloaded backs. They knew it would slow them down, but they also knew they had absolutely no choice. They strapped it all on and kept climbing, breathing supplemental oxygen at a rate of 4 liters per minute. They weren't completely exhausted yet. They were focused, locked in. Eventually, they found a snow shelf, uneven and awkward, but just large enough to pitch a tent. With considerable effort and a fair amount of cursing at the lumpy ground beneath them, they got the tent up as best they could and spent the night of the 27th to the 28th of May hunkered down inside. When they crawled out at dawn the next morning, they were genuinely stunned. The sky was clear and completely calm. It was going to be a good day. They woke their companion, moved through their preparations quickly, and by 6:30 in the morning, they were heading upward again. The first 500 meters went slowly, methodically slowly, but every obstacle they ran into, they found a way past. Then they hit it, a massive wall, nearly 150 meters high, leading directly up to the south summit. It was steep, and the snow on it was in a dangerously unstable condition. In some places, it buried them up to their thighs. In others, they sank even deeper. And the whole time, in the back of both their minds, was the awareness that a single careless step could send them plummeting several kilometers straight down. Halfway up that wall, the lead climber turned and asked his partner what he thought of their chances. The answer was honest. The situation was risky, and being this high up didn't exactly feel comfortable. When the follow-up question came, should they keep going? The response was something like, if you think we have any shot at this, let's move forward. That was enough. Around 450 meters below the south summit, the snow hardened. That meant they could start cutting steps properly into the surface. They paused briefly, caught their breath, and drank something. Up to this point, they had been using oxygen at 3 liters per minute, and they quickly calculated that what remained in their cylinders would last them roughly 4.5 hours. Ahead of them stretched a daunting and dangerous ridge. On the right side, enormous cornices, massive overhanging shelves of snow and ice, jutted out dangerously over the void. On the left, sheer rock faces dropped away vertically. The only viable route was a narrow, steep band of snow running along between the two edges. Fortunately, that snow was firm rather than powdery. A few solid strikes with an ice axe were enough to carve out a step solid enough to stand on. Now, here's something worth pausing on for a moment. Today's high-altitude climbers have crampons, those metal spikes strapped to their boots, along with a whole array of specialized equipment designed specifically to grip ice and hard snow. Back then, you had to hack out every single step by hand, one by one. Even at sea level, that kind of work is exhausting. At nearly 9 kilometers above sea level, it was almost beyond human comprehension. The method they used went like this. One climber would cut a section of steps roughly 10 meters long, then stand firm and belay his partner up through that section. Then they'd swap. One cuts, the other climbs. Switch, repeat. Moving forward inch by inch, both fully aware that one mistake would kill them both. After an hour of this relentless grind, they passed the south summit. But then one of them began to visibly slow down, his movements becoming sluggish and out of rhythm. His partner stopped, looked over at him, and checked the oxygen apparatus. The outlet on the mask had iced over and was completely blocked. It was a serious problem, but a fixable one. They cleared the ice, got the oxygen flowing again, and pushed on. Shortly after that, they came face to face with the most technically demanding section the entire mountain had to offer. And here's the thing. They were the very first human beings ever to see this obstacle with their own eyes. It was a near vertical, almost completely smooth rock face, roughly 12 meters high, positioned at approximately 8,790 meters above sea level. This section, sitting roughly midway between the south summit and the true top, was the single greatest technical challenge on the whole route. For the equipment and physical capabilities of that era, it looked almost completely impassable. One of the climbers described it later, and the account captures the full weight of that moment. After a calm hour of climbing, they arrived at the base of what he called the most menacing obstacle he had ever seen. They had known about it beforehand, from aerial photographs and observations through a telescope, but seeing it in person at that altitude made it devastatingly real. The rock was smooth and nearly holdless. Even for trained rock climbers at lower elevations, it would have posed a serious challenge. Up here, it felt like a wall that simply could not be crossed. Going around it on the steep western side wasn't possible, but on the eastern side, there was a large cornice, and running the full length of that 12-meter wall was a narrow crack, a vertical fissure between the rock face and the cornice. They decided that crack was their way through. One of them wedged himself into the fissure. Using the back points of his crampons and his ice axe, he anchored himself into the frozen ground, grabbed every rock hold he could find, and used his knees, shoulders, and arms, basically every part of his body, to inch himself upward. His back was pressed against the cornice. He was silently praying that the cornice was properly anchored to the rock and wouldn't simply break away. Nearly unconscious from the sheer physical effort, with his partner below feeding the rope up to him, he slowly, agonizingly, made progress. Eventually, he reached the top of the rock face and hauled himself up onto a wide ledge. He lay there for several minutes, just breathing, and for the first time, he genuinely felt, really felt, that nothing now stood between them and the highest point on Earth. He got to his feet, found his footing on that ledge, and signaled to his partner to come up. With the rope pulled tight from above, his partner crammed himself into the same crack and fought his way upward. And finally, exhausted beyond words, like a fish dragged out of the sea after a tremendous struggle, he hauled himself over the top of that last great barrier. That was it. That was the last serious obstacle the mountain had left to throw at them. Though, in that moment, they didn't quite fully grasp that yet. They kept moving. The ridge ahead of them was a seemingly endless series of cornices and bulges. But then, as they crested one more hump in the ridge, the ground suddenly dropped away ahead of them, and beyond it, they could see an open, distant view stretching out over Tibet. The sky felt closer. The ground was starting to level off. A few firm blows of an ice axe, a few careful steps, and then both of them stood on the highest point on Earth. Take a moment to really think about that. Think about what you would feel in that instant. Think about what must have been going through their minds. They had climbed to a place where there was simply nothing higher, nothing above them, nowhere left to go but down. Picture it for a moment. A quiet, clear morning. The sky above you is a deep, endless blue. Sunlight is pouring over the slope in great golden sheets, illuminating every ridge and crevice of the vast, raw mountain landscape stretching out in all directions. There's a silence up there that you almost can't describe, and inside it, a deep, wordless satisfaction. We made it. We got here. We beat every obstacle this mountain threw at us. And then, standing on the highest point on the surface of the entire Earth, the weight of that moment just lands on you. Not like a burden, more like something sacred. A few square meters of snow and ice, and yet the entire history of human ambition seems to be compressed right there beneath your boots. The feeling is overwhelming. It is honor. It is disbelief. And yes, it is joy. Pure, electric joy. Because you were first. Your name would be the one people remembered. You turn your gaze to the west. That must be Tibet. To the east, Nepal spreads out below. You pull out your camera and take photographs in every direction, praying that at least one of them comes out sharp, that your thick gloves haven't accidentally drifted in front of the lens. And all the while, there's this quiet, nagging fear working at the back of your mind. What if the oxygen runs out right now? What if there isn't enough left to get back down? You know you need to start descending. You know it logically, but your feet won't move yet, not just yet. You want to stay. You want to burn every single detail of this view into your memory, every shadow, every horizon, every subtle shift in the light, because you know with total certainty that you will never come back here. And very few people in the history of the world would ever stand where you are standing now and see what you are seeing. It was hard to believe it had actually happened, the summit of Everest, after a savage, freezing night, after years of preparation and sacrifice, after weeks of repeated summit attempts that went nowhere, and now this, A calm, almost gentle morning, beautiful in a way you never expected. You hadn't imagined the top of the world could feel like this. Peaceful, almost warm. The experience was staggering and completely unique. And paradoxically, despite being at one of the most dangerous places a human being can stand, everything felt strangely safe, though you had absolutely no idea how your legs would hold up when you finally stood, turned around, and began the several hours of effort it would take to get back down to camp. Still, going back was not optional. Later, your climbing partner often recalled being asked whether the two of you had been certain, truly certain, that you would reach the top. The honest answer? Certainty only arrived when you were roughly 20 meters from the summit. That was the moment. That was when it finally felt real, when the conviction settled in that yes, this was actually going to happen. Because even with the goal so close, even with the distance down to almost nothing, the conditions, the exhaustion, the physical limits of the human body at that altitude, all of it can conspire to strip away your confidence at any moment. You can never be absolutely sure you'll clear the next obstacle until you actually do. And when he finally stood there beside you on that summit, your partner's reaction was something else entirely. He was far less restrained than you. He reached out to shake your hand. That was his first instinct, his natural reflex, but that wasn't enough to contain what he was feeling. He threw his arms around your neck, slapped you on the back, and shouted out his joy to the empty sky. He was deeply, visibly moved. The two of you had climbed higher than any human being had ever climbed before. You didn't linger long at the top. You took a few photographs. You buried some sweets in the snow and left a small cross there, a symbolic gesture, a quiet marker of the moment. And then, after about 10 minutes, your partner started to slow down. His movements became clumsy. That was the signal. Without hesitation, you began the descent back to base. When you finally reached the bottom and rejoined the rest of the expedition, your partner stepped forward and announced that you had defeated an enemy who was very hard to defeat. News of the conquest of Everest spread immediately. A correspondent received a dispatch that was relayed to Namche Bazaar, then transmitted as a telegram to the British Embassy. The message reached London quickly enough, remarkably quickly, that it was announced publicly during the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. To date, approximately 4,000 mountaineers have stood on the summit of Everest. Every single year, more than 800 people attempt the climb. At the very beginning of this episode, I asked a question. Why do people climb Everest? Instead of answering that directly, let me offer a different question. Why do people choose the harder path when an easier one exists? Why do they take career risks? Why do they get married, have children, run marathons? I've thought about this for a long time, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Everest is the clearest proof we have that the journey toward a goal matters more than the goal itself. The meaning lives inside the grueling effort. It lives in the act of looking deeply inward while attempting to do something that seems completely impossible. Because that internal work, that transformation, that is the real reward. That is why great challenges are worth taking on.